Have you ever wondered what would happen if Luffy was born again with all of his memories and powers? Would the story change completely? And most importantly, would this version of Luffy finally be able to save Ace? Well, let's find out. First, Luffy would grow up in Fuchsia Village alongside Ace and Sabo. Seeing them again would make him incredibly happy and emotional. Of course, he wouldn't reveal that he remembers the future or already has his powers. Instead, he'd simply enjoy making new memories with them all over again. On the other side, when the mountain bandits show up, Luffy would secretly knock them out using his haki, shocking everyone. Because of that, Shanks would never lose his arm in this timeline. Later, Luffy would quietly tell Shanks the truth about his memories, but Shanks obviously wouldn't believe him at first. Then Luffy would eat the gum gum fruit and reveal that its true name is the Hito Hito no Mi, model, Nika. That's when Shanks would finally realize this kid isn't lying and that there's something truly special about him. As Shanks prepares to leave with his crew, Luffy would ask for the straw hat, saying it was the most priceless gift he could ever receive. The two would once again promise to meet in the future, and Shanks would gladly entrust the hat to him. After that, Luffy would spend the rest of his childhood happily with Ace and Sabo, making sure he has no regrets this time around. He would also defeat the Blue Jam Pirates by himself, using haki, refusing to let Ace or Sabo get involved. When the time comes, Luffy would let both of them follow their own paths because he already knows Sabo becomes one of the Revolutionary Army's strongest members, while Ace finds his true family with the Whitebeard Pirates. Ace would even ask Luffy to join his crew, but Luffy would politely refuse because he already knows his own future crew is waiting for him. Finally, until he turns 17, Luffy would continue training, not because he needs to, but because that's who Luffy is. He would keep pushing his haki to even greater heights, and once he reaches the age of 17, he would leave Fuchsia Village and begin his adventure once again. After that, the same events with Kobe would take place, where Luffy helps him begin his journey to become a Marine. Along the way, they would also recruit Zoro into the crew. Even at this point, I don't think Luffy would reveal the truth about his memories to Zoro. Instead, he would simply take him straight to Nami, saying they need a navigator. Zoro would be a little confused, but he'd go along with it anyway. When they arrive at Orange Town, Luffy would instantly use his haki the moment he sees the buggy pirates, scaring them off without breaking a sweat. Both Zoro and Nami would be amazed by Luffy's overwhelming strength. However, I still don't think Nami would tell him about Arlong. Instead, Luffy would surprise her by saying, "Let's head to your hometown and free everyone from the Arlong pirates." Nami would be completely shocked, wondering how he knows about all of that, but Luffy would simply avoid answering her questions. Right now, the crew only has Luffy, Zoro, and Nami. In the original story, Usopp and Sanji weren't with them yet. But honestly, do you really think any member of the Arlong Pirates could stand a chance against a Luffy this overpowered? Luffy would defeat almost every fishman by himself. Of course, he'd leave a few opponents for Zoro so he could gain some real combat experience. With Arlong Park taken care of so quickly, the crew would head straight to Syrup Village to recruit Usopp. The Black Cat Pirates and Kuro wouldn't be much of a threat either. Once again, Luffy would let Zoro and Usopp handle most of the fighting so they could build confidence and gain experience. But if either of them started losing, Luffy would immediately step in with his haki to protect them. After everything is over, Usopp would join the crew, and Kaya would gift them the Going Merry. Seeing his old ship again would make Luffy incredibly emotional, and tears would fill his eyes. The rest of the crew would just stand there confused, wondering why he's so attached to a ship they've only just received. After that, Luffy would lead everyone to the Baratie to recruit Sanji. They would keep trying to convince him to join as the crew's chef, but Sanji would continue refusing. Then Don Krieg would arrive, but this time, Luffy would defeat him with his armament haki before Drackle Mihawk even shows up. When Mihawk finally arrives, he'd be genuinely impressed, wondering why someone capable of using such powerful haki is still sailing around the East Blue. Zoro would still challenge Mihawk to a duel, while Mihawk would also be interested in testing Luffy. However, Luffy would refuse because he wants Zoro to face Mihawk himself. He knows that this defeat is exactly what pushes Zoro to become much stronger in the future. Just like before, Mihawk would easily defeat Zoro, but afterward, Luffy would tell Mihawk not to get too comfortable because one day, that very swordsman would surpass him. Those words would leave both Zoro and Mihawk with even greater motivation for the future. At the same time, Luffy's words would also inspire Sanji to chase his dream of finding the All Blue. With that motivation, Sanji would finally decide to join the crew. Their next destination would be Logue Town. Most of the events there would play out just like in the original story, but there's one major difference. Since Luffy defeated the Buggy Pirates so effortlessly using haki, Buggy's crew wouldn't be there looking for revenge. However, don't celebrate just yet. During the battle at Arlong Park, at least a few Marines would have witnessed Luffy using haki. Because of that, his bounty would be much higher than it was in the original original timeline, creating a whole new problem. This time, Smoker would arrive with far more Marines and a much better plan to capture Luffy. But Luffy already knows Smoker is after him, so he'd easily avoid getting caught. He would even visit Goldie Roger's execution platform without any trouble, while Smoker could do nothing but keep chasing him. Because of that, Monkey D. Dragon wouldn't even need to step in. Instead, he'd simply watch from afar, proud of how strong his son has become. Now comes everyone's favorite part, the Grand Line. But instead of entering the normal route, Luffy would tell the crew to sail through the Calm Belt. Naturally, everyone would think he's completely insane because of the Sea Kings. However, Luffy would insist that everything would be fine, even joking that he's been there before. Using his powerful haki, he'd safely guide both the crew and the Going Merry through the Calm Belt without a single problem. Eventually, the crew would meet Laboon. This time, Luffy wouldn't let Laboon keep hurting himself, and before leaving, he'd make sure the giant whale calms down and regains hope. To move the story forward a bit faster, the crew would eventually meet Vivi and continue the journey as usual. They would still need to recruit Chopper, but before that, they'd stop at Little Garden. Instead of letting the giants keep fighting endlessly, Luffy would help settle their conflict and easily defeat Mr. 3. Since Luffy already knows Nami is about to fall seriously ill, he'd immediately decide it's time to recruit Chopper. So, without explaining much, he'd lead the crew straight to Drum Island, leaving everyone else completely confused about how he already knew where they needed to go. On top of that, Nami would already be seriously ill, but after everything Luffy has done and the incredible strength and kindness he's shown so far, the crew would completely trust his decisions. Eventually, they would arrive at Drum Island. Without wasting a second, Luffy would carry Nami up the mountain by himself. Using Gear 3rd, he'd launch himself straight to Dr. Kureha's castle in a single jump. This would be the first time Nami sees Luffy using a form like that, but because she's burning with a fever, she thinks she's just hallucinating and imagining everything. After reaching the castle so quickly, Luffy would be unable to hide his excitement because he already knows Chopper is waiting there. The moment he sees him, Luffy would run over and give Chopper a huge hug. Then he'd immediately start begging Chopper to join the crew, telling him how valuable he is and how much everyone will need him. Of course, neither Nami nor Chopper would have any idea what Luffy is talking about, but Chopper would still realize that Luffy is being completely sincere. Even Dr. Kureha would encourage Chopper to leave the island and sail with them. Now let's fast forward to Alabasta. This time, Luffy would tell everyone else to stay on the ship while he heads into the kingdom with Vivi alone. Once he finds Crocodile, the fight would be over almost instantly. Luffy would defeat him in a single battle without any real difficulty. Right after that, he'd walk up to Nico Robin and ask her to join the crew. He'd tell her how important she is to their future, and even say that they've already been friends once before. Robin would be completely stunned by those words, and the rest of the Straw Hats would be just as shocked. They wouldn't understand why Luffy was inviting someone they still considered a criminal to join the crew, but since Robin was always destined to become a Straw Hat, she would eventually accept the offer anyway. And because Crocodile was defeated so quickly, the Alabasta Civil War would never even begin. The next stop would be Skypiea. When Luffy tells everyone there's actually an island in the sky, the crew would think he's lost his mind, but Luffy would confidently tell them not to worry because he's been there before. Then, almost as if fate itself wanted to prove him right, a ship would suddenly fall from the sky. At that moment, everyone would finally believe him. Before heading up, the crew would still stop at Jaya. So how would Luffy's meeting with Blackbeard go this time? Would he eliminate him on the spot? Sorry to disappoint you, but no. Since the Alabasta arc ended much earlier than it did in the original story, Blackbeard wouldn't have even arrived at Jaya yet. The Straw Hats simply reached the island far ahead of schedule. Instead of running into Blackbeard, Luffy would go straight after Bellamy before he could cause any trouble. He'd defeat him without much effort and even leave him with a warning for his boss, Don Quixote do Flamingo, saying, "You're next." Now it's finally time to head to Skypiea. This time, the crew would rent a different ship for the trip so the Going Merry wouldn't suffer unnecessary damage. As soon as they arrive in the sky, Luffy would immediately sense Enel's observation haki and head straight toward him. Using his gear forms, Luffy would defeat Enel with ease. Then, after ringing the golden bell, the 400-year conflict surrounding Skypiea would finally come to an end. Once everything is over, the crew would return to the Blue Sea and continue sailing aboard the Going Merry. Next comes Long Ring Longland, where Luffy would meet Kuzan, better known as Aokiji. So how would this encounter play out? Would Luffy actually defeat him? The moment Luffy sees Aokiji, he'd immediately recognize him as a serious threat and activate Gear 4th to protect his crew. Seeing that, Aokiji would be genuinely surprised. He'd realize that Luffy has already become incredibly powerful and that defeating him would require going all out. But Aokiji is still the same laid-back person as always, so instead of fighting, he'd simply let the Straw Hats leave without getting in their way. Since the Going Merry is still in excellent condition, the crew would have no reason to search for a replacement ship. Because of that, the emotional conflict between Luffy and Usopp would never happen in this timeline, and the two would never end up fighting each other. When they arrive at Water 7, Luffy would save Iceberg before the assassination attempt and track down every member of CP9 one by one before they even get the chance to kidnap Robin. Honestly, none of them would be much of a challenge for a Luffy this strong. Since Luffy saved Iceberg's life, Iceberg would reward the crew by upgrading the Going Merry for free. That means the Thousand Sunny wouldn't exist in this timeline, but we'd get to see a much stronger and upgraded version of the Going Merry instead. So far, everything seems to be going perfectly, right? But you're forgetting one very important person, Frankie. The problem is, the Straw Hats never went to Enies lobby in this timeline. Because of that, they would never build the deep bond with Frankie that convinced him to leave his family and join the crew. Even after Luffy asks him over and over again, Frankie would still refuse. Eventually, Luffy would have no choice but to leave Water 7 because Garp would arrive with the Marines, and Luffy's first priority would be protecting the rest of his crew. So with a heavy heart, he'd say goodbye to Frankie and continue his journey. Thankfully, recruiting the next crew member would be much easier. Soon, the Straw Hats would meet Brook. The moment everyone sees him, they'd be completely terrified. But Luffy already knows who Brook really is. He'd instantly say, "Come on, join my crew. We're already great friends." The rest of the crew would think Luffy had completely lost his mind. But eventually, Brook would happily accept the invitation. Next comes the Thriller Bark arc. Honestly, there's not much to explain here because everything would end ridiculously fast. Luffy would defeat Oars all by himself, wrapping up the battle in no time. Then, with a single punch, he'd knock Gecko Moria unconscious. Everyone would be celebrating. But here's the catch. Up until now, Luffy has handled almost every major battle by himself and ended them far too quickly. That creates a huge problem later on. The crew never gets the chance to develop the same battle IQ, teamwork, and combat experience they gained in the original story. Those missing experiences will have serious consequences in the future. Since Thriller Bark ends so quickly, the crew would leave before Bartholomew Kuma even arrives. That means the Straw Hats would never be separated. From this point onward, the story changes in a massive way. But if you're enjoying this What If so far, make sure to subscribe. Because let's be honest, most of you won't unless I remind you. So, let's continue. This timeline also means there won't be a 2-year time skip. Even so, Luffy would still tell the crew that it's finally time to slow down and train. He knows that the enemies waiting in the new world are on a completely different level, and everyone needs to become much stronger before moving forward. So Luffy would head to Sabaody Archipelago and meet Silver's Rayleigh. He'd ask Rayleigh to personally train the entire Straw Hat crew. Naturally, Rayleigh would refuse at first, but then Luffy would reveal something that immediately catches his attention. He'd explain that the Straw Hat originally belonged to Shanks. Luffy would also tell Rayleigh that he was the strongest member of Goldie Roger's crew after Roger himself. Rayleigh would see the same spirit and determination that once belonged to Roger shining through Luffy, making it impossible for him to refuse. Instead of training only Luffy like in the original story, Rayleigh would train the entire Straw Hat crew together. While everyone is training, the news of Ace's execution would finally spread across the world. The moment Luffy hears it, he'd calmly say, "Just like I expected." However, Luffy wouldn't take the crew with him this time. He'd go alone and arrive at Impel Down before Ace was ever transferred for his execution. Since Ace would still be imprisoned there, Luffy's rescue mission would become much easier. Magellan would still stand in his way, but this version of Luffy could even use Gear 5th if necessary. At that level, defeating Magellan wouldn't be much of a challenge. Without wasting any time, Luffy would fight his way through Impel Down and finally reach Ace. The moment Ace sees his little brother standing in front of him, he'd break down in tears, overwhelmed that Luffy came all the way there and risked his life just to save him. Luffy would quickly free both Ace and Jinbe. He'd also release Emporio Ivankov and the other prisoners who became allies in the original story. However, Buggy, Crocodile, and Mr. 3 would all remain locked inside their cells. Since Ace disappears from Impel Down before the execution date, the Marineford War would never even happen. As a result, Whitebeard would remain one of the 4 emperors, and Blackbeard would never obtain the Gura Gura no Mai. Now let's move ahead quickly. At Fishman Island, the Straw Hats wouldn't run into any major problems because it would still be under Whitebeard's protection, so most of the events there would play out normally. After that, the crew would arrive at Punk Hazard, but notice one huge difference: Ace is still alive. Because of that, I don't think Jinbe would officially join the Straw Hats in this timeline. At Punk Hazard, the Straw Hats would meet Kinemon and Trafalgar Law. Instead of letting things escalate, Luffy would settle their disagreements and convince them to work together. He'd also promise Kinemon that he'd definitely come to Wano soon and help free its people. Now let's fast forward once again. By this point, the Straw Hats have become so powerful that Doflamingo wouldn't even dare interfere with them early on. And since Ace is still alive, the entire conflict over the Mera Mera no Mi would never happen. Even so, Luffy would still take the crew to Dressrosa and charge straight toward Doflamingo. Realizing that Luffy is no ordinary pirate, Doflamingo would fight him seriously from the very beginning. But let's be honest, the moment Luffy activates Gear 5th, the battle is basically over. Now you're definitely not ready for what happens at Whole Cake Island. Most events would begin the same way. Sanji would still leave with Big Mom's crew, and the Straw Hats would follow to bring him back. The biggest difference is that Luffy wouldn't wait around this time. He'd immediately use Gear 5th and challenge Big Mom herself to rescue Sanji. In my opinion, since Big Mom is generally considered weaker than Kaido, she'd eventually lose to Gear 5th Luffy. Because of that victory, the world government would officially recognize Luffy as one of the 4 emperors of the sea. Everyone, including Shanks and Ace, would be incredibly proud of how far he's come. But the biggest challenge is still waiting: Wano. The moment Luffy arrives in Wano, he'd head straight for Kaido and activate Gear 5th. In the original story, Kaido had already fought multiple powerful opponents before facing Gear 5th Luffy, so he wasn't at full strength. This time, however, Kaido would be completely fresh, making the fight far more difficult than before. That doesn't mean Luffy would lose instantly, but the battle would be much closer than it was in the original timeline. Luffy wouldn't have the luxury of playing around with Kaido this time. The real problem, though, isn't Luffy. While he's locked in battle against Kaido, the rest of the Straw Hats would be fighting the Tobiroppo and Kaido's strongest officers. As I mentioned earlier, because Luffy solved almost every major conflict by himself throughout the journey, his crew never developed the same level of battle experience, teamwork, or combat IQ they had in the original story. Yes, Rayleigh trained them, but training can never fully replace real battlefield experience. As a result, one by one, the Straw Hats would start falling in battle. Then Luffy would witness King defeating Zoro. The moment Luffy tries to rush over and save him, Kaido would catch him off guard and land a devastating attack. Watching his friends die right before his eyes would completely shatter Luffy's focus, making it impossible for him to fight at his full potential. In the end, the Straw Hats would fall one after another, and their journey would come to a tragic end in Wano. I know, almost nobody would have expected this story to end like that, but sometimes changing the past creates even worse consequences than the original future. Anyway, that's the end of the video. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to like and share, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on this ending, so let me know in the comments below.